wishes that he could have been here this evening. And I don't know where Sheila went, but thank you, Sheila. She helps with everything. So that's us, the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at USC. We are a research institute, and although we are the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, we actually aren't centered here at the Crusoe Center. We're up on campus because we're a research center. And we're dedicated, as our flags say, to research, dialogue, and renewal of the church, of course, but also of society and culture at large. And we want to do that by continuing what's been a very ancient practice of faith-seeking understanding. And we want to do that by bringing faith and reason together to address contemporary issues and enduring questions. The Institute pursues truth, humbly but fearlessly, through conversations with religious leaders and scholars from all branches of human knowledge. And so in that vein, it's an honor and a delight to welcome Professor Maryanne Wolf to USC this evening. And I think that you will come to agree at the end of the evening that she is both humble and fearless, both personally and professionally. Professor Wolf is a cognitive neuroscientist. She's the director of the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA. She's the former John DiGiorgio Professor of Citizenship and Public Service at Tufts, where she directed the Center for Reading and Language Research. Her PhD is from Harvard in Human Development and Psychology, and she holds master's and bachelor's degrees in English literature, and the list of her awards and scholarship goes on for pages. However, she introduces herself in this wonderful book that I commend very highly, called Reader Come Home. She introduces herself as a reading warrior, that is, one who does battle over the importance of reading and literacy, and as a farmer, one who, like farmers, tends and nurtures and raises precious resources. And in her case, that precious resource is children. After reading her book, I would also call her a bridge builder. As bridge builders do, she thinks across boundaries, figures out how to cross borders, and make connections. She has built and continues to build bridges between the sciences and the humanities, between the digital world and the world of print, between action and contemplation. Bridges between the university and primary and secondary schools, between teachers and parents, bridges between children and their parents or teachers, bridges really between us and them, whoever the us is and whoever the them is. And so, less importantly, but perhaps noteworthy in our context here, a bridge between the university on the west side of town and USC. Please join me in welcoming reading warrior, farmer, and bridge builder, Professor Maryanne Wolf.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Becky. Thank you so much. You know, Emily Dickinson said, "The soul selects its own society." And that's who you are tonight. I never know who's going to be there, but tonight I knew it was going to be special. I knew somehow through my letters with Becky that you would be a very special group of kindred spirits. And I give sometimes lectures to 1,000 people, and I never know who they are. But you, anyone who comes to a talk with that title, you've got to be very select and very special. And it's a joy for me to have come here and most special of all was to meet Lee and Becky in person and to have just a moment out of time to talk about things that are dear to the soul as well as the heart and mind. And I am going to be giving you a 45-minute whiz-bang seminar on a lot of topics, but at the root of them is this single assumption that I hold so dear, that literacy needs to be considered a basic human right everywhere. And part of my work is to ensure that it's everywhere. And you'll see a little bit of work in South Africa and India, rural United States, but very importantly, our own backyards, our own homes. Now my work, as Becky said, is in cognitive neuroscience, and I always trip, so just look forward to it. It's just true. But my work is always connecting, and in this case, we're connecting our understanding of what the brain does when it learns to read with cognitive behaviors like literacy and numeracy, and how we can use this knowledge to help change how teachers teach. I look at Ellie over there and her linguistics background. How do we use this knowledge about language, about the brain, about how the brain learns to read, learns to speak? How can we use these knowledge bases to help us teach children so that we refuse, we resist the idea that some children are just going to be doomed by 4th grade? And for some of you, you have no idea, but that in the state of California and in the United States, you know this very well, and you do too, only 1/3 of our children in 4th grade and in 8th grade reach a level of literacy, of proficient literacy, that allows them to have critical analysis and empathy. This is unconscionable in our country. This is not me working in Ethiopia where there are no schools and no teachers. This is here. This is our backyard. And these are things that we can change, and these are things that we must change if, and this is going to be, if you will, whetting your appetite or foreshadowing. This sounds like it's about the reading brain, but it's about democracy. We are talking about the fact that if one and only 1/3 of our future citizens have a level of proficiency in reading that allows them to have true critical analysis, what does it say for their ability to discern truth itself? How in the world can we change this? We must. My talk is not going to be about that. But when Becky called me a reading warrior, I couldn't resist this part of the talk, which I usually give other audiences. So I just, no matter what, I'm going to get it in there. And when she says I'm a farmer of children, I am that. But today, tonight, it's sort of like, for me, the talk that I'm giving you is a luxury for my spirit. So Becky gave me this opportunity. And where we all rest, if you will, is in this great hinge moment. Robert Darnton, the librarian at Harvard University, uses that phrase to talk about how, we make these great transitions in communication. And not that long ago, only 6,000 years ago, we moved into the beginnings of written language. But now, not millennia, but mere decades, we're moving from written language to a digital culture with implications for everyone. Now, from my standpoint in neuroscience, the first absolute premise is that literacy is a circuit that changes our brain. If you are non-literate compared to you who are literate, it's not you have more or less intelligence. Socrates was non-literate and probably one of the great geniuses. It's not that, but it's that we are able to connect our knowledge in ever new ways with literacy. And when we change the brain of an individual, that elaborates over time. That changes society, which changes the species. Now, what's happening is that the reading circuit is plastic And we'll talk about that just for a few minutes. But that means that the plasticity of the brain means that it's going to be changing according to different things. It changes according to the writing system. Those of you who speak Chinese or Japanese, you have beautiful, right visual cortices that are far more elaborated than the rest of the people in the room. The brain reflects the writing system, it reflects the education, and reflects the medium. And that means there are going to be changes in how we read in a technological culture, which has both promise and perils. Now, I use Nicholas of Cusa. Oh, it's so happy to come to an Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies because no one knows who Nicholas of Cusa is. And he's not the most obvious, but he is a fantastic philosopher who really had this concept of learned ignorance. And so he used that concept when he says, if we have this coincidence of opposite forces that can be equal truths, what do we do? Well, in this moment in time, I want to talk about the promise and perils of technological culture versus print culture in terms of two forces that have truths within them. But what we do about them is based on knowledge. And that's what my whole talk is going to be about. What knowledge can we bring to this question of two truths? And again, thanks to being here rather than, well, I actually was in the Vatican, as Becky knows, 2 weeks ago, so I used this slide in the Vatican. You can imagine why. Again, if you know Nicholas of Cusa, you may know Romano Guardini, who also used Nicholas of Cusa to talk about what we do. And what he was saying, and what influenced Pope Francis, particularly in Laudate Si, is that what we can do to reconcile is to really learn, to really have knowledge, and then to go above them. And this is the term that Nicholas of Cusa used, learned. It's not learning ignorance. No. It's learned ignorance. Take a stance. You do not know all this. And that's part of the reason why in this book, this Reader Come Home, it's an epistolary genre. It's a series of letters to convey to you. We are in a moment of time where we're accruing, we're getting this knowledge, but it's evolving. And a letter conveys to you, not that I know everything on this topic, but that it's something that I want to have a dialogue with you about. Well, Nicholas of Cusa, Romano Guardini, and Pope Francis are really talking about that too, about different opposing forces that can have different truths that we must investigate and learn about. So part of my work, and I'm only going to speak 1 minute and I'll go whizzing through these slides, is about the promise of technology, the democratization of knowledge that it allows, how it gives access, how it gives equity. And part of our work is in rural Ethiopia, in South Africa, in some of the schools, because what we're battling is non-literacy. And there's the minimum of 57 million who will never become literate. There are 120 to 150 who are not functionally illiterate, but the figure is probably close to between 200 and 300. So what we have in part done is to gather our different disciplines in technology and neuroscience at Tufts and the Media Lab at MIT in Georgia. And what we're doing is we are curating the reading brain for apps that will address it in fun ways for children to learn to read who have no schools and no teachers. So our first deployment was in Ethiopia with a tablet, this is 2012, that was indestructible. Ha! There is nothing indestructible. Just want you to know, we learned that very quickly. But the reality is we were using this in various countries to help figure out, and we're not there yet, but we are getting closer and closer to understanding how we can use technology for not just supplementing what happens in the classroom. In some of our classrooms, there are 100 kids per teacher. Just imagine what that teacher has to do. 100. And we are working on various apps, not only curating, but creating apps that are a lot of fun for kids so that they can learn to read the precursors of reading. And we are extremely confident that soon enough we'll be able to make inroads into these terrible figures. But tonight's talk is not about that. It's not about the promise. It's about the perils. And I'm warning you, I'm not going to depress you, but I want you to be aware of the knowledge that we are gaining about how things in the reading brain circuit are changing. Now, one of the things that I have to begin with is to repeat this statement here. The brain was never meant to read. None of you have a single brain cell devoted genetically to reading. You do for language, for vision, for all these other things. Wonderful, wonderful. Not for reading. It's an invention. But what the brain has is a capacity to rearrange itself to make a new circuit. Those of you who knit, you don't have a genetic program for knitting either. In fact, I'm the proof you can't be the nurtured. Forget nature. I can't knit a house. Well, anyway, never mind. Anyway, but the reality is this brain can change itself to build up a circuit that can handle these new functions. So what we're going to talk about is reading, but you can imagine as we move into the 21st century, we're going to have a lot of other new circuitries. But if you look, does anybody speak Chinese or Japanese? Here, anybody? What do you speak? Chinese, perfect. Look at your beautiful right. It's gorgeous. Now, you have to have that much because by 5th grade, how many characters do you know, generally reading a newspaper, how many characters you need? You won't believe it. I mean, most people don't know this who speak Chinese, 5,000. 5th graders. That's why you need that right visual cortex to be so beautiful compared to these alphabet speakers around you who have 26 letters and they're always complaining. I always say that. You know, it's a joke. But we have other things that have to be hooked up. And as our linguist friends in the room know, we have a real phonological sound system that has to be hooked up to the visual system, which make our complexity different, and the brain reflects it. That's the point. The brain reflects the writing system, and it also reflects the characteristics of the medium. And those characteristics are part of the story that I want to involve you with me tonight. So my colleague Patricia Greenfield in the psych department has said various things about the differences in mediums, but this one was so pivotal. Every medium has its costs and weaknesses. The cost in the digital medium seems to be to deep processing, time. Now I want you to think, if you were in a seminar with me, we'd spend a lot of time talking about the parts of the circuit and how they have to get connected in time. Because the beginning part of that reading brain has to be fast enough to allocate time to the more sophisticated processes. Now, we're going to look at that in just 1 minute, but I'm going to ask you to think with me about what you do in what I'm calling deep reading. If you were in literature, you might have called it close reading, those of you who are in literature. But as a cognitive neuroscientist, we want to go underneath the surface of close and look at some, not all, some of the most important aspects of that close, or what I'm calling deep reading. The first is background knowledge. You must, when you look at a text, connect it to what you know. Now, I'm not even going to talk about, with 40 minutes with you, I'm not even going to talk about the implications of not having enough background knowledge in our children, or being over-reliant on a button to think that you're going to know everything because you press a button and it's available. You have to know what you don't know. And so background knowledge is pivotal in our generation. But background knowledge for us who are expert readers really is, and Alberto Manguel is such a beautiful writer. At night, I'll just tell you a little secret, all these little anecdotes that just pop in my mind for you. At night before I go to bed, I read Alberto Manguel. He calms me with the beauty of his ability to pull all the things he's read into his works. And what he says is this: each new reading builds upon what the reader has read before. That is for us, and that is for our children. And this concept by Joseph Epstein is that if we would just examine any person, we would have to know what he or she read and when, for in some sense, we are what we read. So that first part of that circuit is bringing together the background knowledge of what we have read. But I'm going to ask you to go beyond Joseph Epstein. It's not only what you read, it's how you read what you read. So we're going to move that maxim, and we're going to do it by examining these deep reading processes. Background knowledge, we are connecting by analogy. Human beings are analogical thinkers. We are from infancy making analogies always. What we know to what is in front of us. But one of the most neglected aspects of the knowledge base about deep reading is empathy. Empathy is what happens when you leave the text behind. And one of my favorite, I have several favorite ways of thinking about this. This psychologist, Hockenmulder, talks about it. This is our moral laboratory. When you leave yourself behind, you pass over into the ideas, the thoughts, the feelings of other. Now, when Becky was talking about us versus them, when we read, and we read deeply, we erase the verses. We identify, we pass over. In the words of the theologian John Donne, we pass over into the lives, the thoughts, the feelings of other. And when we reach that point of passing over, when we really understand what that other is thinking, we then are enriched, and we come back to ourselves a different person. Slightly, ever so slightly, we are always changed by what we read and who we read. And John Donne, who was my teacher at Notre Dame, used to always say this: it is the capacity to pass over to others and come back to ourselves that is part of this golden rule, the golden key. And many of us never, ever get there. But I look at this from a theological standpoint, from a literary standpoint, and this is a more philosophical and ecological one. An evolving understanding of others is the foundation for a future on our increasingly connected planet. I'm going to return to her in several ways, but I want you to see that stories, and I'm not just talking about stories as an adult. As you heard, I consider myself a farmer of children. Well, the stories are crops for children. Just think, Charlotte's Web. What more empathic way of thinking about someone who's a pig, for heaven's sakes, and you're a spider. But what if you're a frog and Toad is sick? The stories of childhood are teaching us to literally leave ourselves and learn something about how the other would like us to be. So we are developing this compassionate imagination from a philosophical viewpoint. Now, for my colleagues who study literature from a more psychological viewpoint, this is a wonderful phrase. What's a piece of fiction? What's a novel? What's a short story? It's a piece of consciousness. And here's that word again, from theology to literature to psychology, passed from mind to mind. That's what we do when we read. And I will admit that one of the things I try very hard not to do is to give my political beliefs in a presentation. However, that said, I will give you and use your inferential processes to talk about what Obama, our former president, said when he visited. He didn't ask Marilynne Robinson to come visit him. Those who have not read, Becky and Lee and I were talking about this tonight. If you have not read Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, please, that's your homework. Don't read me. Read Marilynne Robinson's Gilead. It's a trilogy, and you don't have to read them all. I recommend that you do, but the work Gilead is this extraordinary novel about what a mid-70-year-old with a heart condition wants to give. He's a minister, wants to give his very young son, who he knows will never know him as an adult. So he's writing these letters to his son, and they are letters of wisdom. Now, people always get mad at me when they first read it. They said, there's no sex, there's no mystery, there's no murder, nothing interesting. No, except life. And that's what it is. It's the wisdom of life. And Obama went to her and said, he called her something like an ambassador of empathy, but he said, I learned about empathy. I learned about compassion. I learned about how the world's not black and white through novels. Because novels were teaching me who others are. And Marilynne Robinson said, the trend towards seeing those different as sinister other is the greatest danger to continuing our democracy. This is my talk. If I only have one little quote to give you, it's the connection between what we do when we read at the deepest level and enter the life of other, and how that reflects upon us as members of our society and our culture. Now, there was somebody else who said something interesting about novels. A lot of people are asked, are novels going to die? I'm even asked. And Jane Smiley was asked this, and she said, they're not going to die. The problem is that they might and probably will be sidelined. And if they are sidelined, we will have leaders who do not read and who will never understand who others are. This was without anything but your own inferential processes. Now, one of the interesting ways that empathy is conveyed is through imagery. And this is a hard one. Some of you already know this short story. Ernest Hemingway was asked in a wager at Key West by his bourbon-drinking buddies whether he could write a short story in 6 words. Some of you have read this, but those of you who haven't, I think it's one of the more poignant examples of how images can convey our ability to take on another. So for those of you who've never read this, you'll see what I mean. This is what we do. We take an image. We take an image and it propels us to enter a whole way of thinking about what happened. And what we do in terms of our brain is that we are constructing a perspective of other. We're constructing a theory of mind. And that plus empathy can lead us to that compassionate imagination that we talked about earlier. But those aren't the only processes we're using. I liken what's happening in the middle of these deep processes to Sherlock Holmes and the scientific method. Because just as I teased you facetiously about using your inferential processes, you were doing that. You were deducing from little things that I said without using anyone's name. I was asking your brain to seize bits of information which together go beyond the information. That's inference, that's deduction, induction, and that all contributes to critical analysis. And critical analysis is one of the major points to what deep reading really is about. Critical analysis is when we are connecting all those processes, what is read, what is known, with our inferences, and we evaluate our hypotheses. And here is where I don't have, oh goodness. Oh, please, would you do me the greatest favor? Like, I should have asked you before. So you have frontal lobes that are exposed. I do this in all my audiences, and usually I tell the person beforehand, but since I had dinner with you, I hope you don't mind. But what is happening is that our left frontal lobe is generating hypotheses. Is that true? Can we? What's the evidence? So you're building it. You transfer over to the right, and the right is testing you. And it's like a dance. It's a frontal dance, back and forth, back and forth. And then it goes back to the left, and you get an imprimatur of truth. I wouldn't have used you. You've got too much hair. Sorry. But the reality is that's what we do when we are being truly critical analysis. Now, that takes time. What I just showed you takes milliseconds. This is what the brain is doing. The brain needs time. And when we don't give it, we are shorting it. But what we are doing with this critical analysis is we're putting it all together. But what if we aren't Sherlock Holmes, or for goodness sakes, Benedict Cumberbatch's sociopathic version of Sherlock Holmes? But, now only some of my audiences know this, but I am depending on you. What if we were Miss Marple? She's the one who pulls critical analysis and empathy, understanding, motivation. With my college students, I usually use Legally Blonde, because she did that too. But Miss Marple does that so well. She's really adding to all this stuff of the scientific method and understanding of what others feel and think and motivation. So when we talk about our reading brain, we're really talking about critical analysis and empathy at its best. And here's where I will use Marilyn Robinson a second time. If we are putting this together, we are en route to our best thoughts. We're not there yet, but we're en route. And this is what she said. If God has taken pleasure in his creation, some part is in your best idea, your most disciplined thinking on whatever is true, honorable, just, pleasing, and worthy of praise. You see, that's what I think about as the part of our brain's reading circuit that prepares us to reach out and have insights into whatever has come before. And insights are our way of inviting all of the things that are in our brain. And as Jonah Lehrer said, to share the secrets. We have secrets in us that we don't even know that can be elicited in our best reading. And I used Thomas Aquinas, my neuroanatomist colleague. Catherine Studley drew him. I think he probably was a little fatter, larger in girth, as we might say more kindly. But he, in G.K. Chesterton's biography, said, when asked what he was most grateful for, he said, I'm most grateful that I understood every page I ever read. What a beautiful goal for our children, if we could give them that. But I want you to just look at, this is what your brain is when it reads. This is what you do. You are generating so much, you're pulling it together. And when the circuit is at its fullest, we reach the furthest to our best thoughts. This is what I call the contemplative function. That is at the end of what we do when we read. Most of us, including absolutely myself, I never reach that most of the time. But I'm trying to structure my day and my night. That's why I read Alberto Manguel at night. But I try. And I want you, if there's any take home, it's read Gilead and try hard to read something that centers you, that takes you outside yourself and gives you a moment in your day to be contemplative. Now, Aristotle once was, in many ways, not just once, but was thinking about what is it that makes a good society? And I use him to talk about what makes a good reader. And he said we can judge them by 3 lives: the life of activity and productivity. That's the life of knowledge, or the life of enjoyment in the Greek sense of leisure. But it's the 3rd life that I worry the most about that he said. We need the life of contemplation. And by the same token, I think that the good reader has 3 lives. But we are losing this contemplative. In my letter 9, which quite frankly was a heartfelt exercise for me, that was the last letter in my book, one of the publisher editors said, "Oh, you don't need that." You know, I understood what they wanted, but I need you to realize this is where we are this is where I worry we are going to lose, where we are going to lose in that circuit, the very end part, that we don't usually have time for the contemplative, but let us beware its loss. And the evidence for that loss, I'm going to very quickly go through just a few slides to show you where the evidence is. In children, I work with pediatricians, we are really learning that our kids are learning so much from their digital screens, but they are not learning language as fast as when the caretakers are humans. And we know this from brain imaging slides, where I'm not going to show you any of those, but you look at the brain imaging slides and you see what is happening when a child listens to the parent, listens only to the same story audio tape, or in one of the bells and whistles of video. Not a question. The language regions are most activated for the human. Audio is next, and the video is last. And it tells us a story about what is happening to the quality of attention in our young. And my clinician friends like Catherine Steiner Adair, who wrote a book called Big Disconnect, they're seeing all these additional attention issues in our children. What do they say when they go offline? Everybody in here knows it. What do the kids say? I'm bored. I don't believe any of you ever use the word as many as most kids do. And it's because we have a different level of stimulation that they are becoming accustomed to. And it's raising the fight-flight hormones in our children. But as much as I'm worried about them, I'm even more worried about my young adults who are our students. And there was a recent meta-analysis by colleagues in Europe, and they did a meta-analysis of 50 studies, over 50 studies, with over 170,000 participants. And there's only one task: read the same story in print versus a book. Okay, same story, and then you get comprehension questions. Print. That's what they're better at. Now, do they think so? Absolutely not. So when you analyze the last 3 years of the data, people like Ellie, you'll be your age, you're digital, you're a digital native. So do you think it was print or digital for that group? What do you think? Who says print? Who says digital? No, there's got to be some. Well, the reality is the print superiority effect was even greater for the recent ones. Why? And then you ask, and you do qualitative analysis. They think because they're faster, they're better. And again, speed, and David Ulin, your journalist, said this, we cannot say that speed is illumination. Now, the reality for us is that we're all in this. We're keyword spotting, we're browsing, we're skimming, we use a Z pattern or an F, we're distracted multiple times an hour, and our attention and our memory are all changing as a result. Every one of you, not just our children. Now, whether we're talking about poets, where's the wisdom lost in knowledge, where's the knowledge lost in information, or we're talking about what happens to us as a society. My worry is that if we are going to lose these precious milliseconds because we're skimming, remember the circuit reflects the medium. If all you're doing is key spotting, word browsing, and skimming, your circuit is going to skip the deep reading processes that are necessary for complexity. The last thing I want is, and this is what the Swiss wrote an article about me as an interviewer, and I hated the title, but it's still apt. They said, are we all becoming Twitter brains? This is the last thing we need in the complexity of a world in which we are literally on the verge of a climatic tragedy. We cannot afford to have a Twitter version of policy, of thinking about complex issues. We do not only lose complexity, and David Brooks had this beautiful essay where he said, somehow, sometime, beauty has gone missing. When you are skimming, you're not really appreciating the beauty of language itself. Will you ever have time to truly take on the perspective of others? Will you become ever more susceptible, without Lee's frontal dance, to an inability to distinguish truth from falsehood? When people talk about fake news and false information and all that, I'm pulling my hair out, because the reality is, of course, no one can tell the difference. And some of our studies at Stanford at the Digital Literacy Lab are showing that some of our best, quote unquote, best students are susceptible to fake news, false news that are adjudicated by profit and political motivation. Now, this is not me as a politician or a political person, but as a cognitive perspective who is worried about our susceptibility, our vulnerability to false hopes, fears, and ultimately demagoguery. All of this is a threat to our society as a democracy. And I use these last slides just to show you that we've had wonderful discussions about what a democracy does, but I so appreciated Name of the Rose Umberto Eco and Cardinal Martini, who talked about how this delicate game, the exchange, it's the exchange of perspectives that adds to our collective moral conscience. And you see, when you're a skimmer, one of the things that I talk about in that book, and I can't have time for you tonight, maybe in a question, is when you are skimming, you're actually doing it as a defense mechanism for the glut of information that you are bombarded with. We all are. So I'm not saying it's just this negative thing, but it can have a pernicious effect. Because when you're skimming all this stuff, you are changing how you read, which changes what you read. And so we have a population right now, many, including my own brothers, they will only read the silos of information that make them comfortable, that they know and think are true. Therefore, they're even more susceptible to false information in those silos that make them not have to think. That's where we go. We're either a Fox or we are MSNBC. This is not the way to build this collective moral conscience. We need each other's differences to be able to build that. And so I am going to end with last three slides. Again, as I said, Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, said this: it would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. And I suggest to you that this is not a binary. To go back to Nicholas of Cusa, it's not about two truths that are irreconcilable. It's really understanding what we disrupt or diminish by either medium. So my colleague Sherry Turkle said we transgress not because we are trying to build the new, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what it disrupts, and I would say and diminishes. I do a lot of talking up north, and including in Silicon Valley, and they are congratulating themselves always, and my son works at Google, I'm right in the midst of this, and the word disrupt and being a disruptor is just like the praiseworthy nature. I ask, what are we disrupting? I ask, we must disrupt the disruptors and ask them to figure out how can we change this so that change does not mean diminishment of the things that are most important. And so I end my book more or less in letter 8 or 9 with hoping to reconcile it by building what I call the biliterate deep reading brain in our children. I won't go into that perhaps in questions you might want to know, but what I'm really asking is that all of us realize we're in this hinge moment. That's a test. The greatest test ever made of human wisdom and decency may very well come to this generation or the next. We must teach and learn broadly and seriously. This comes from the work Given Us of Things by Marilyn Robinson. So I end with this way. We have a charge, and that is to really demand knowledge and demand people to talk about the knowledge in both the promise and the perils of reading, so that we really become wise. And my teacher, John Donne, said, wisdom is not contemplation alone, not action alone, but contemplation in action. And that's how I want to end with you. And I give my charge to you. I give it away to you. This is the dialogue. Now you do something with it. Okay, goodbye. I did it.
You can keep going.
No, we'll have questions and answers.
Somebody who's a helper. How can I make this mic work? And I'll come around so everybody can hear the questions, and then, there we go. In that way, the questions will be on the video.
I'm Patrick Whalen, I'm a pediatric specialist. So this is a very Catholic dialectic between faith and works.
Yeah.
I wonder if you
but
saw...
I work with pediatricians. Reach out. Are you part of Reach Out and Read? I need to bring you in. Seriously. Barry Zuckerman, Perry Class. Are these familiar names?
I know Perry Class.
Yes, well, she and Barry created Reach Out and Read, in which pediatricians have a program in which they give a book at every well visit that is appropriate developmentally. And they're working on dialogical reading. And we have really good data from them, from Robert Hutton in the Cincinnati Hospital, in which we can show that the kids who are read to, which is part of a campaign I want to bring to LA, is showing that those who are part of that Reach Out and Read group, their language regions are far more activated, both expressive and receptively.
Well, my question was...
Sorry. I get so excited when pediatricians are here.
I wonder if you saw an article that was syndicated a couple of months ago. It's about a technology for blind people, and it involves a postage stamp size sensor that they sit on their tongue, and it has a wire that travels to a camera that's mounted on their head.
Wow.
So the camera translates visual stimuli into a electric stimuli. So there's a tactic, the tongue basically is taking a visual stimulus, using the two-point discrimination capability of the brain, which is part of the brain that doesn't normally participate in visual stimuli. And I mention this just because the idea of translating one form of sensory input into a different form of sensory input, and giving it a route into the brain in somebody who's visually compromised. One of the striking things in the article was that they said, this may seem like a bizarre you know, unexplored kind of a thing, except that we do this every day when we read, that we're taking a visual stimulus and turning it into an oral stimulus.
Right, exactly.
And I've been struck, you know, by the way the brain processes sound, that it's much more primitive sensation, that it's through the brainstem with all of our emotions, our emotional life, the fight or flight response and all of that.
Absolutely.
And I just wonder, you know, from your perspective, this idea of, you know, taking a visual stimulus and sending it through a completely different sensory pathway affects the way that the knowledge is assimilated in our brains.
It's a beautiful question, and I didn't read the article, but I immediately know what they're doing. And when you read, you are, if not all of us are the same, but we are adding the articulatory capacity. For example, and it's not just articulatory, the motor system is very involved. So when you, let's go back to Anna Karenina. When Anna Karenina leaps in the tracks, your motor system is going. Your legs are literally being activated when you leap. So we've got a lot of interesting ways of thinking that so much is more activated than we think. Now what you're describing is a beautiful analog to Braille, to the tactile. And Ellie and I were talking about, one of my teachers was Carol Chomsky, Noam Chomsky's wife. And Carol wanted to do that with the deaf, to have a kind of a way of having a it was a vibratory system of trying to translate sound into tactile, it didn't really go anywhere, but it was, again, how do we do cross-modality work to help us? But yes, we can do, and in the future, my colleagues at Thinking Reader in CASC, it's called computerized assisted technology in Boston. They're doing all kinds of things, like you're saying, for different handicapping conditions. I'd say in 20 years, we'll have all kinds of ways that we can do things we never thought we could. But it's a beautiful example. I would love to have the article. I don't have it. But excuse me, back to my point, I really want you to become part of Reach Out and Read. And this is something you would, if you're in this talk, you would really like to be part of their work. It's incredible. Maybe we can talk about it afterwards. Okay. Any
other questions?
And don't you be shy at all. You know, this is not the audience to be shy. We are a group. It's a select society.
Oh,
good. Ms. Garrison is here. Here's mine. Is it Sheila Garrison? Sheila Garrison.
Hi, I'm Debbie Sims. I'm a professor in the writing program here at USC.
Oh, wonderful.
And I just wanted to ask you for advice or thoughts about parents who are navigating the pressures of the current academic sort of space, right? With kindergartners are now doing what third graders used to do.
Ridiculous.
And it's really a challenge to push back against those pressures, because we want our children to succeed, we want them to keep up with their peers, we want them to do what the teachers are asking them to do.
Yes.
But a lot of that requires encouraging this kind of skimming and this specific kind of engagement with technology. Do you have any thoughts about how to find that balance, or how to empower our children to handle it?
Yeah. You can imagine I have a whole set of letters on that in this book, because it's so important. So there's about 3 different directions I can take your question. I'm going to take it to this direction, but I will say, before I reach out to this slide to describe what my proposal is, that we have to understand that that reading circuit is physiological, right? It exists with real areas that have to be myelinated. And you remember in biology, your axon is going to have this myelin sheath that will speed up transmission. Well, there's a schedule for myelination, and in somewhere between 5 and 7, one of the major connective areas in the reading circuit is myelinating only between 5 and 7. And it sometimes even myelinates a little later in boys. But the reality is that many a kindergarten teacher is being asked by the principal to do reading that pushes them beyond their limits so that their third grade reading scores will be better. So we've got the worries of a society on the principal's shoulders being translated into a kindergarten teacher, into a 5-year-old who's not ready. So one of the things that we're trying to do in California is to have screeners. In fact, we've got a new bill passed in which we want ultimately to have a screener that can show us what are the most likely profiles of different children and what do they need to become optimal readers over their own schedule. So there's about 6 or 7 different constellations based on prediction work that we did in Boston with MIT and Children's Hospital and my group at Tufts. We all work together with the largest prediction possible. And you will see that some of these kids are just not ready. So we want to test in the beginning of kindergarten, at the end, and have assessment that's that early so that we can usher in differential intervention and instruction by 1st grade. That doesn't mean we don't work on the precursors, and that some kids, I'll never forget Pauline Kael said, well, she read at 3. Well, fine. You know, I'm all for those little outliers that make my life miserable. But the reality is that most of us are, physiologically and pedagogically and developmentally more likely to be learning the precursors, which are the parts of the circuit, without being demanded to connect them. And if you look at some of the studies by, for example, Usha Goswami, she's either at Oxford or Cambridge, I can't remember which, but she did a European study and looked at who has the easiest time reading by age, and it was those countries that were learning to read later. So we, in the interest of trying to help, we so frequently make mistakes. And I have no amount of, I empathize with principals and teachers and parents. But the reality is that a lot of individual variation exists. And one of my major mentors was the pediatric neurologist, Martha Dankler from Johns Hopkins. And she's writing me now, I'm her former student. She said, Maryanne, do something about all these boys. And because she has 3 sons, so I think she's, worried about her grandsons. But the reality is that a lot of the boys that she's seeing in Johns Hopkins Clinic have been pushed, and they're becoming emotional, detritus because they are being asked, and they're not dyslexic. We could show the difference between those children who are dyslexic and those children who are developmentally delayed and those children who are just struggling. They're going to be fine. But we've got to put our money where our research is. That's a very long-winded, I'm not even going to get to that. But that's letter 8, Sheila.
As a parent of a couple of college-aged kids, I see this distraction, and obsession with their phones and things of that nature. But I guess my question is, deep reading, does it matter that they read or what they read?
I'll bet if I pushed you, you would say it's both. It is what and how. And the reality is, if I have 2 hours with you, I will have all this work on preserve and expand. We should not be in this binary situation. We should be teaching our children around age 10 to 12 digital wisdom so that ultimately they can read on any medium with deep reading. I want that for everybody. But the reality is some mediums are better for different purposes in reading. So one of the things I want our children and our young adults to know for themselves, because there is individual variation, what is the purpose of this thing that I have to read, and what do I know I do better with? And they have to learn what is better for them. For example, there is no way I want anybody in this room to deep read your email. Please. But if it's a contract, if it's on voting, if it's a poem, print it out, hold it. There's a lot of research by people in writing and critical thinking who are doing work on the kinesthetic aspect, that words literally have heft in the printed form. There's the geometric aspect to what words are. But our students don't know that. And in terms of distraction, it's 27 times an hour. The average student is distracted going between mediums, different devices, 27 times. Now, what does that do to the quality of attention? What does the declining quality of attention do to the consolidation of memory? It all is of a piece. We have to know more about what each of us do best. And I'm on technology as much as anybody else, but I know it bleeds over. And if you read my book on letter 4, you'll know it was a horrible experiment that I did on myself to see how I was changing too. It's a really humbling experience. Talk about humble. It's a humbling experience.
And we'll maybe have one more after
Okay,
this. And
thank you. I have a child who did not read until 4th grade, and now has a PhD and reads wonderfully.
Yeah.
And the difference was that he picked up Chaim Potok in 4th grade and started to read it, and then read every book by him. Right.
Yes.
My concern about your doing these kind of profiles on these youngsters is how different would that be than his being put in the lowest level reading group, which to this day he wants to tell off that teacher who is now dead, that it was such a horrible experience. What would you do differently?
Okay. First of all, we have to change our entire idea that children who read differently are less intelligent, and that is one of the first things that every child who doesn't read like everybody else thinks. And the teacher, it's not about what she or he did wrong with an intervention or not. It's how she or he conveyed what they thought about the intelligence and the gifts and the strengths, as well as the weaknesses of every child. My own son is dyslexic. I know only at 4th grade did he start reading too. But we never let him for one moment think that he was any less intelligent, less gifted, less strong than anybody else. But that there's a lot of variation. And one of the things that we want to do, and to say profile, I'm using that as a constellation of strengths and weaknesses. And you're bringing me to, when we define dyslexia, we're not just talking about weaknesses, we're talking about strengths. One of my favorite chapters I just wrote was on why Leonardo da Vinci was undoubtedly dyslexic. And it's just profiles of strengths and weaknesses. It's not one or the other. Bless you, bless you.
Okay,
Last
we're gonna have
question I know.
Because we have to have two.
Oh, 2? Okay, I'm here.
Father Percy Bacani of Precious Blood Church,
Oh, wonderful.
pastor and theologian.
Yes.
I'm assuming that deep reading leads to contemplation because it would require a tremendous unpacking of the human experience. Because once that is not unpacked, then it is isolated. It's never put in the context of a certain moral imagination. So I would assume that someone who reads deeply is able to contemplate as well.
Yeah.
That there's a space for silence in that whole process.
You could just give the next lecture. But you really could. And I'm going to give you a little tiny gift, which you might want to pursue. And it's a book by the priest Pablo Dors, D''O''R''S. It's called The Biography of Silence. And he talks, we had to give a talk together in Milano last fall. And we were shocked at how here he's a theologian dealing with contemplation and meditation, very, very much using meditation. And we were coming to similar conclusions from very different lenses, that it is the act of deep reading that prepares us to move into contemplation. It doesn't ensure it. That's the problem. It doesn't ensure it. So, what is it that? There's this beautiful line about creativity that we are poised for it. We don't necessarily cross into it. But what I would say is that deep reading poises us for contemplation. And it's up to us to realize we can make that tiny synaptic leap. But we must give ourselves the time to do so. But I just know you would love, it's a little tiny book, very small, this big, Biography of Silence. I think you would really love it.
Okay, really, last word.
Last question.
Last question. My name's Mike Eng, and I've been working in higher ed administration recently. I know at an institution, I was at Santa Clara University, we were very strong support of community-based learning,
Yeah.
particularly to teach empathy. And I was really curious about your comments about empathy and development of empathy from the perspective of an educator, to get students into community situations that they would be uncomfortable with, where they actually learn more about what other people go through. I was just wondering if you've done any study on that or any reflection on that.
It's a wonderful line of thinking. Tonight over dinner, I described one of the groups in London and Liverpool that are using novels and reading them within the community to inspire a more connected feel. So they are going into prisons, they're going into homes for the elderly, they're going into juvenile delinquency centers, places where people are feeling disconnected, and using novels, and they're reading to them. They're not forcing the person who often is, especially in prison situation, less than functionally literate. They are reading to them in these places, and they'll read a passage, and then everybody talks about it. And there's so many good things that are coming out about how people feel better about themselves when they read about the suffering and the joys of others, and then you share that experience. So I don't know if you would be interested in that group, but Philip Davis and his group in Liverpool, and he's in the English department, and he's a George Eliot scholar. And they're using sometimes Shakespeare, sometimes, Charlotte's Web, but they're using different things that inspire people to have, and I was reading this morning, to have a sense of universal care. Wouldn't that be special if we could, in all our little ways, just contribute to that? So that's what my wish is for you, that you contribute to universal care.